evening, I'm Virginia Trioli and welcome to Q&A. Here to answer your questions tonight, philosopher and author A.C. Grayling, Liberal frontbencher Zed Seselja, Israeli parliamentarian and feminist Mirav Mikhaeli, who wants to end all marriage, Independent Senator for South Australia Lucy Goshohe, and Shadow Attorney General Mark Dreyfus. Please welcome our panel. Q&A is live across Australia on ABC TV, iView and News Radio at 9:35 Eastern Standard Time. And you can stream us around the world on YouTube, Facebook and Periscope. You can't escape us. Our first question comes from Sunita Sebastian.
With the marriage equality vote underway, it has made us look into the institution of marriage and its value. With the rising divorce rates, should we continue the concept of marriage as it is? Should there be a focus on relationships and commitment, and having a pledge of commitment instead?
There's the challenging question. Anthony, we'll hear from everyone on the panel first up. Anthony Grayling, do you care to answer that as a philosopher or as a married person?
As a philosopher, if I may. You know what philosophers do is they draw distinctions. There's actually two quite different senses of the word marriage. There is the legal institution in which you invite the state into your bedroom and has decisions over your lives, and it's a very sexist institution in its origins and shouldn't exist in that form at all. But there's another sense of the word marriage, which is the commitment that two or perhaps more, I don't know, people make to one another about pooling their resources, sharing their lives, mutually supporting one another. And that sense of marriage, what Shakespeare was talking about when he said the marriage of true minds, I think is very important to us as human beings, because we care about the affections and we want somebody to love and be loved by. But in the institutional sense, I'm against it. However, I am for same-sex marriage. Now, that's a different thing.
Well, I think we have a question on that, so we'll get to that. Zed Seselja, you can answer it in those two parts, or you can assume the institution.
Sure. Look, I think that marriage is well worth persevering with. I think that it has been...
You make it sound like such hard work.
As an institution. Well, I've persevered for 18 years and it's going pretty well so far, but I have to ask my wife. But I think it's a beautiful institution. I disagree with AC. I think it actually has been very important for us as a society, and not just us as Australians, but right around most societies in the world in one form or another, and certainly in the form that we understand it. So I think this idea of a lifelong union between a man and a woman has been something that is foundational to our community, and it's absolutely worth defending.
Mirav, you didn't even let Zed Seselja get through that answer without lowering your eyes and shaking your head. You have a rather jaundiced view of this institution, don't you?
Well, you know, it was created back at the time when we women were commodities, as were children, as were men without property and of other colours. So this is not something that we should maintain in a world when we realize that all of us are human beings. It is not about love. I realize that the campaign for the Yay says that love is equal. Love is definitely equal. It's got nothing to do with this institution. This is a tool that was made to dominate women for the sake of reproduction, for men to have legal custody over children, which are to the largest, I would say, chance of certainty, their own flesh and blood. Yep. This is not something that we should sustain.
We'll get into all of this. Let's quickly hear from the rest of the panel if we can. Lucy?
Well, I'm informed about marriage by my background, my history. And I am not a philosopher, or I'm just a mom and dad out there. And what I understand and the way I know it is marriage forms the backbone of most families. And a family is the lowest bedrock of any civil society. Stemming from that, I would say, let us all be informed about our conviction, about our belief system, which comes from who we are, how we believe, and what we are all about it. So for that, I think it is something that has persisted history, tried and tested, and should be preserved and enhanced and renewed.
Mark Dreyfus, institution or commitment?
I think the institution has changed immensely over the last 3,000-4,000 years. Go back as far as you like. It is still evolving. What we have now is not what biblical times had as marriage. And one thing I'm absolutely certain about is while we persist with the institution of marriage in Australia, we've got to have marriage equality. which is, of course, the debate that's on us now.
Well, we have a question about the nature of marriage and love, and it comes from Alexander Pereira.
Miss McKaylee, how could you say that marriage has nothing to do with love and romance when traditionally marriage is thought to be this ultimate, pinnacle binding between two individuals that truly love each other?
Easily. Even as we speak, there are so many societies, I don't know within Australia how much that is well spread out, but in many countries, marriage have nothing to do with love because they're an arrangement. Your parents make you marry someone because of their social status, because of the family they come from, because they want to keep the property in a specific family or another family. Many, many arrangements. And throughout the years, traditionally, yes, love was a nice bonus. And if you had to commit to having sexual relationship with only one man, then you would have preferred to like him to some extent. But this was not the reason why marriage was created, and it's not why it lasted.
No, but accepting that in those cases there are arranged marriages and even forced marriages, there are still many, many people who marry for choice and marry for love, as Alexander has said. In fact, that's the only reason they're marrying is because they love each other.
I don't see why, if you love someone, why you should go to the manager and register. How does that enhance your love?
They choose to.
Well, so we can discuss free choice. How many of the things in life do we do because... And that brings us back to marriage equality and to why, as much as I am opposed to the institution, I see no way how civil rights, and as long as the state gives away rights and duties and privileges according to this institution, how can it deny it from part of its citizens? I don't see how that can happen.
All right, well, let's see. Our next question comes from Jenny Augustin.
I would like to know what differentiates Australia from other countries that have legalised same-sex marriage but have not experienced any special circumstances or consequences. Is this simply a slogan of fear aimed to dissuade people from making change?
Mark Travis, we might start with you on that one.
Well, 23 countries in the developed world have got marriage equality. Countries very similar to our own in a cultural or political sense, Canada, the UK, New Zealand, the USA, have all had marriage equality for years now. And as far as I can see, and I've visited all those countries, they have only benefited from achieving marriage equality. I'm very much hoping Australia does not have to be the last country in the developed world to get marriage equality. We're on the track to get somewhere, it would seem. But no, in answer to your question, Jenny, I don't think that any dire consequences have befallen any of those countries which have already long since achieved marriage equality.
Lucy Gichohe, you have warned of unintended consequences if Australia goes ahead and legalises same-sex marriage. What would they be?
What I meant and what I think is 2 weeks ago, there was this doctor who was in the No campaign, and I have seen people asking for her to be delegated for her views on being on the No campaign. My understanding is people may not get to understand that we are just debating as Australians, and after this debate, we need to continue to live together in love and unity. When I see a whole doctors, people saying she needs to be delegated because she was in the No campaign, that is the kind of consequences that I'm fearful.
Oh, I thought you were talking about unintended consequences of there being same-sex marriage, not of the actual debate itself.
It is the unintended consequences of the debate and how we may perceive each other, forgetting we are made a great nation by our great diversity. This is one more diversity, and I hope that after all is said and done and the storm settles, we will continue to view each other as Australian but as not same-sex all traditional marriage labels.
Well, let me ask Edsa Selja on this, because, I mean, you've made it clear that you prefer the definition to stay as it is between a man and a woman. But the question goes to just what makes Australia so different that we think we might not be able to get through this in the way that all those other countries have.
Well, I don't think I certainly haven't argued that we're that different. I would look to some of those examples that Mark has given. If you look at Canada and the UK, two pretty similar countries to us in many ways. So in Canada, there's been a number of instances where, since they changed the law to redefine marriage, for instance, parental choice has been affected when it comes to things like sex education in schools. Steve Kouloukis, I think, is the individual who had a very high-profile court case where in Ontario it was found that a safe schools type curriculum, he wasn't able to object to that, to ask for his children to be taken out of that because it was deemed by the courts that whilst he had his right to religious freedom, that was trumped by the equality aspects in the law. Now, that is an impact, a real impact on people's parental rights. And another example, in Canada, Trinity is a law school, I understand, and if you are a law graduate of Trinity, it has a conservative view of traditional marriage. It has been found that because of students taking a pledge and believing certain things, they can't practice law in certain parts of Canada. I think Ontario ruled against them. So we've seen in the UK a Jewish school which has been told that unless they adopt the sort of safe schools type curriculum, the gender fluidity, that they may have their registration threatened. So those kind of effects on freedom of speech, freedom of religion, parental rights have played out in other parts. This is still a relatively new thing. We know, I think the first country to change the laws on same-sex marriage, I think, was Norway in about 2001, but most of those countries cited have come in the years subsequent. So we're talking about a few years of experience, in some cases only a couple of years.
As we've seen in the debate so far, where this conversation comes to then is a conversation about whether what you've just described necessarily flows from same-sex marriage, when the debate is really only about the union of same-sex people. But let's get to that later. Miro, I feel like I need to come to you because you look like you're about to explode.
Oh, no, not really.
But you clearly have some objections there. What would you like to say?
No, I like it so much when the right takes the terms that the left has brought, about human rights and turns it around and is fighting for the right to suppress other people. I really love that.
I don't think parental choice... I think parental choice in how your kids are taught about sexuality is actually important.
Don't allow your child to find out for themselves what they prefer, what they like, what they want to be when they grow up. Don't allow them. Just deny them of free choice. Well, yes, by all means.
Well, Mary, when we've had the debate here on safe schools, and safe schools has been in schools here in Australia and parts of Australia,
which actually precedes.
Sure, but one of the concerns and one of the points that was made in some of these court cases is it's much harder for parents to object once the law is changed. So we have had debates about this, and the overwhelming number of parents who I speak to, and certainly if you look at various ways of measuring this, the overwhelming number of parents do want to have choice in how their children are educated in these matters, and I think that is reasonable.
With your permission, Virginia, this is not funny. The core family, as we know it, unfortunately, is the least safe place for children, not in Australia, in the Western world, and in more traditional societies even more so. The data speaks about every fifth child that goes through some kind of abuse, sexual, physical, emotional, and the core family is the place which exactly those parental rights that you're talking about, and the custody, this total custody that we have in this structure of marriage, which still gives men domination, complete domination over their children and too often over their women, and who are called wives, is a part of the ongoing hurt in children. So I do want to put the discussion on parental rights in perspective and in context, and the context of what are the values of this core family that you are protecting so much.
So, I obviously disagree with you, and I disagree vehemently that this idea that the family is this inherently unsafe place
this
for
is
children.
reality,
I fundamentally disagree with that.
Well,
and I don't think
had you been working a little bit for the benefit of, and recognizing violence and domestic violence, you would have known that this is just the reality.
I'm very aware of the issues around domestic violence. And,
well, apparently not.
Excuse me. I'm very aware of the discussion in this country, and our government has taken very strong measures when it comes to domestic violence, but I disagree with your assertion that the family is somehow inherently unsafe. Certainly some families prove to be unsafe for children, and we have ways of dealing with that, but the family is not inherently unsafe for raising children.
Anthony Graydon, let's hear from you on this one.
Everything has been extremely well said, but I'm with the lady, I'm afraid, on this one.
I'm not surprised, Asa, I'm not surprised.
That's okay. But I think the tenor of the discussion shows that the more open and inclusive and fair-minded people are, the more we want our children, for example, to have an opportunity to think and reflect about the diversity that there is in human nature and human experience. I mean, think what it would be like to be brought up in a very traditional, very right-wing, closed family and be gay, and what a terrible torment that might be. Whereas to have an opportunity to hear at school and from friends how they think about things and how things might be, and to feel just part of the human community. That's the thing we want to achieve. The point about rather ideological views, especially if they're on one part of the political spectrum rather than another, is that it closes down opportunities for people, and that's precisely what we don't want to happen.
Anthony, and panel, just before we move off this subject, we've got some other questions coming up. I accept your point, and the data does show that when it comes to abuse of children, it is in the clear majority of cases, someone known to the child or in the family circle. I don't think you can argue with that. But what alternative model are you putting forward for these families when the marriage has worked for me, for many people I know? That's the reason we come together, in order to have a safe, happy place for ourselves and for our children, and we support that. What's your alternative model? Because I think you're probably in a minority in wanting to abolish marriage altogether.
Well,
so what do you got for us instead?
Oh, okay. So first and foremost, I want to say that I'm all for love. The guy who asked before, I'm very much in for love, really. But really,
yeah,
unfortunately, no. And it does not necessarily have to do with who you make a child with or who you bring it up with. That's one of the things that we need to start breaking apart. I believe that instead of marriage, the state should offer two kinds of default agreements. One is custody over children. A child can have more than two parents. They don't have necessarily to be his biological parents or her biological parents. The person who takes responsibility for the child, and someone must take responsibility for the child, needs to be obligated for certain criteria that the state should actually decide on. What does it mean that you are responsible for the child? And I believe, of course, it has to consume a lot of freedom for the child to be who she or he is.
And you want the state deciding this?
No, what do you mean the state? It's us coming together in a democracy, which we'll discuss, I suppose, later, what it means in a democracy. We all together decide what it means to be a good parent. The other thing is that the other kind of agreement that should be made by a default option by the state is for a shared household. Those components, those major components of marriage that have to do with social, economical, financial aspects that we do not discuss when we get married. You know when we discuss them? When we divorce. Then it becomes a war, because then these aspects which were not discussed before, the contract was not made, then it all explodes. So we need to be transparent from the beginning, and a shared household not necessarily has to rely on couplehood or sexuality or romance. It can be roommates, it can be sisters, it can be friends, and it can be a couple who loves each other and want to live together happily ever after, by all means. But we need to stop one of the most devastating parts of marriage, which is the unrecognized work that women do in the house and caretaking of children that is still not recognized in the economy.
Well, there's your alternative model. We'll move along. And
Part of
remember,
it.
if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A, do let us know on Twitter and keep an eye out for RMIT ABC Fact Check and the Conversation websites for the results. Our next question comes from Atem.
Australia is a successful multicultural society. This success and a sense of belonging and social cohesion is built on the relative ease by which citizenship is obtained. In fact, citizenship was once seen as evidence that migrants have completed their integration into Australian society successfully. Are the changes to citizenship proposed by the Australian government undermining the sense of social cohesion in Australia and likely to create a group of people who could not have the rights of citizens and the privileges of citizens?
OK, Lucy Gichohe, let's start with you, because, I mean, you have a particular immigration experience here as well. So what's your perspective on the new test?
Yes, I do, and I have talked to the minister and I have had a look at the policies, the changes that are proposed, and there are two aspects that I have focused on in this test and new citizenship rule. One of them is the English test. The proposed level of English testing is IELTS level 6. That is, of course, very high. Having said that, I know that as Australian, we need to come together in a cultural cohesion. And language is one of the things where we can do that. Language is one thing that we can all come together to do. However, the level of competence is too high for an ordinary mom and dad who only needs to go to the shops, understand the bank statement, go to the doctor, and do that kind of basic day-to-day activities of living. So what I'm asking the minister to do is to reconsider from level 6, bringing it to that level where ordinary mom and dad can fit in and can pass that English. The other thing with this IELTS is that it's very discriminatory in nature. There are some countries which are exempted for this testing.
Yes.
So I'm considering and asking the minister to consider a situation where that bit is removed altogether. So where we have that either everybody tests for it or people coming from Commonwealth countries background are exempted. So the minister is willing and continuing those discussions. The law is up for debate, and I think that is something he's open to consideration.
Well, we do have another question on this, so we'll get straight to it, and then we'll hear from the rest of the panel on this. Our question comes from Nida Barami.
So the government is planning to introduce a more difficult citizenship language test, but supposedly people from Canada, New Zealand and USA will not have to sit this test. My question to the Assistant Minister of Multicultural Affairs is, do you think this is a fair test, or is this a backward step for a multicultural society?
Sister Selja.
Thank you, Neda, for the question. I think that if you look at what makes our multicultural society work, certainly it's the bringing together of people from many different cultures, the ability to celebrate that, the ability to hold on to aspects of culture, whether it's language or other things. I think that's been a great thing. But I think also what makes us a cohesive society is the ability to communicate with one another, the ability to have some shared experiences and to have some shared values. And so when we look at this debate, if you look at the English language test in particular, the idea of people living in a society where they can't easily communicate with one another, I think is one that none of us would really want to see over time. We know that when people first arrive, and I know with some of my own family's experience, it takes, of course, a while to learn English. But I look, and even with some of that broader family experience and with friends and others, and if I look at some people who have lived here for many years, lived good lives, no doubt about it, but if you were to ask them, and if you were to look objectively and say, would it be better if they had a higher degree of English proficiency so that they could better communicate with their neighbours, so they had better job prospects, so they could, in some cases, better communicate with their kids, because that can be an issue for some generations. I think it's inherently a good thing. Now,
so I'm going to jump in there, though, and press you on this, because the question went to whether it was a fair test.
Yeah.
You think it's fair?
Well, I think the idea of
level 6, as Lucy has pointed out with her misgivings, is fair.
Sure. Well, I think there's been a little bit of misinformation by some in the opposition. I'm not saying Lucy, but I think the opposition has sort of run this campaign.
The question's not about the opposition, it's about whether it's fair.
But in terms of the fairness of this test, I'm going to that. About how it's university level, it is not that. It is a competent level. Now, I wouldn't be obsessed about level 6 versus level 5, but what I do think is very, very important is that we have an improved level of English proficiency. As we've had this debate over many years on both sides of politics, there has been calls for stronger levels of English proficiency as a condition for citizenship.
But I think
people like Tony Burke.
But we're dancing around stronger, better English. No, versus there's a specific level that's been mentioned here and will be used if it's not changed. And Lucy Shigoha has already pointed out the problems with that. But the other part of it are the 50 countries that list English as an official language, but only citizens of 5 are exempt from this test. New Zealand, the United States, Canada, Ireland and UK, countries where the majority population is white. Now, that looks to many like a somewhat racist policy.
Well, look, I don't accept that.
So why are those countries exempt?
Well, my understanding is that that is an extension of other parts of immigration law that are reflected right now. Now, I'm not the immigration minister, but that is my understanding, that those countries, in other aspects of our immigration law, they also have certain exemptions. And whether that's because of administrative efficiencies or because of the traditionally close relationship between our countries, I don't know the history of that, but this has been reflected in immigration law for a long time, and I don't believe in any way that is driven by racism.
You've just mentioned in answering the initial question that if some of your family members were asked to sit this test, they'd probably have problems with it. They wouldn't be able to reach that level 6. So surely you must have misgivings and issues with the fact that 5 particular countries are completely exempt from the test.
Well, the other part of the story, Virginia, that needs to be told is just how much we put into things like the Adult Migrant English program to give people every opportunity. Absolutely every opportunity.
But that's once they're through. I mean, if they don't get through this, they don't get through.
No. Go on. This is a government that has reduced English language
I'll let Mike
teaching.
jump.
This is a government that has reduced the support for English language teaching. The whole concept is offensive, that we should be asking citizens or new citizens to speak university-level English.
It's not university level. And that's why you have to... You've put a falsehood there to say it's university level to make your point. But
the test is... Let me say something. The test is already in English. This is a government that is pretending to be doing something that relates to national security. It has got nothing to do with national security. Every single person affected by this already lives in Australia. They're being told by this government that it wants to change the law to make it another 3 years of permanent residency on top of the 1 year that's required at the moment, and that they have to speak university-level English. It is the opposite of what we should be doing for social cohesion, and Zed should be ashamed of himself, coming from a migrant background, to be putting this.
Thank you, Mark. Well, I should have the opportunity to respond to that, Mark. The idea that migrants or children of migrants wouldn't have a view that integration is a good thing and that English language might be a good thing. Well, if you let me finish, I think that's offensive to say that because you have a migrant background you have to have a universal view. Well, a lot of migrants and a lot of children of migrants would believe that learning English is actually a unifying thing.
The test's already in English, Zed. The test is already in English.
But not at a competent level. And I think that having a competent level of English, and not university, as you say, is a very fair request before someone gets the opportunity.
I just want to go back to Lucy Gusho. Hey, IELTS 6 to you, as you said, is too high. Do you think there's a reasonable level that can be expected of people, migrants in this country, that is not that high? Want to put a number on it?
Absolutely. My thinking is we don't have to use IELTS to test for people's ability.
What should we use?
I mean, there are so many other options to do English and study English and get teachers teaching people the language. I think there are so many options available. My idea of this IELTS, it's for professionals, it's for people out there who are going to be doctors, lawyers, but it's not for a mom and dad who needs to do driving tests, take their daughter to the school, communicate with the teacher. There must be, because IELTS is just too hard for even us professionals. Just don't do it right.
I think we might go back to Nita. I think you wanted to add something to your question. Is that right? We're just looking nodding and shaking at the same. Did you want to say something?
No, it's fine.
Okay. Look, I did want to hear from Mirav Mikhaeli on this. I mean, is there a perspective you can bring as an Israeli politician?
Well, I think I'm saying enough controversial stuff as it is, and I'm a non-Australian. I wouldn't get into this discussion, even though you can guess where my heart is here.
All right. Well, you're behaving on this one, so all right. We'll move on to the next question. Our next question comes from Liza Hildreth.
A 2013 Lowy Institute poll suggested that a majority of young Australians are ambivalent about the virtues of democracy. Between then and now, the world has seen the rise of wolf in sheep's clothing populism and new age despotism, evidence of a global malaise surrounding democratic institutions. As a high school teacher and an advocate of active, informed participation in the political system, how can I best encourage my students to not only participate in the democratic process, but help them to see the value of it and help to shape it in the future?
I think, Anthony, this is a question for you straight up, but we'll hear from everyone.
Yeah, I thought it might be. Thank you very much.
It was the democracy bit that gave it away.
It did. Look at the situation with the democratic systems of most of the advanced countries of the world today. They've evolved over the last century and a half, 2 centuries, really from the late 18th century, in order to solve a problem that was identified by an extremely elitist and superior view put forward by Plato 2,500 years ago. I know everybody in this room was reading Book 8 of the Republic last night, so they'll remember the argument, which is that if you put power into the hands of the people, and because the people are insufficiently well informed and they're very self-interested and they're short-termist and very often prejudiced and so on, that they're not going to come up with good decisions and they're not going to constitute good government. And for that reason, he thought, and it's about the only thing I agree with him, that everything should be run by philosophers. He's right about that. But when you consider the fact that people have a right to a voice in the government of their own affairs and to have a say on the laws that they're going to live by, and you therefore want to put into the hands of people the final say in giving them political authority, you also have to honour a correlative right. They don't just have a right to a participation, but they have a right to good government as well. And so the problem is, how do you parlay that authority that the people have into sound and stable governmental institutions? And this is something that was very painstakingly and carefully worked out right from the middle of the 17th century onwards, and especially in the thinking of people like Madison and others in America. But it's gone wrong. It's gone wrong because the people who populate these institutions and who operate the systems have realized that in order to get their agendas through, they have to manipulate the system a little bit. They've got to introduce party discipline of sufficient strength that MPs will represent the interests of the party and not necessarily of the country sometimes. It's also the case that money and lack of transparency in our democratic systems has made people very skeptical about them. And finally, what we've seen in recent years is the advent of techniques culled from the kind of data you can get from social media has enabled campaigns to manipulate opinion without people knowing.
Sure, but Angie, the question went to just how Liza can actually try and reinvigorate her students around this system that you describe as so completely broken. So would you like to try and... Well, first of all, would you encourage her to do that, to get her students to engage in the democratic process, or do you think it's so broken that she shouldn't bother?
No, I would encourage her to do it, because I think actually the system itself, if it were operated correctly, would be fine. I mean, you know, very, very little in human affairs is perfect, and our democracies aren't perfect, but they can be made to operate responsibly if operated correctly. So what we want is to get activism going, get these young people to be interested in politics, politics and interested in the structures of government and interested in making them completely responsible and transparent so that they will work for the benefit of the country as a whole.
Yes, transparency, I know, is a key part of your argument. I want to hear from the politicians this evening, though, as well. Mike Dreyfus?
Liza, I think it's a great question, and I think participate. Which is
how? How?
Get involved, join a political party, go and visit your local MP, write to your local MP, email your local MP.
I think Anthony would say that joining the political party would be part of the problem, right?
No. I've read Anthony's books, and I don't think that, forgive me, I don't think Anthony is saying don't join a political party. In fact, a lot of your work is about participation. And I'm for participation, and I think it's a great message to give to everyone in Australia, but particularly young people, that it's worth participating. That's the real point.
But surely only if they join and then change that political system, because you see that system as so controlling that it will basically imprison those young active minds.
No. Well, one mustn't be so pessimistic about it. Well, one should say, look, get involved
I guess I see
in
it from
order.
a particular perspective, but yes.
Get involved in order to make it work.
Says the Selja.
Look, I think, firstly, thank you for the question. I think the poll that you cited is a concerning one, that only about half of young people are anything other than ambivalent about democracy. I think, we need to work on that. We can look at what parts of the system are broken and what they might be responding to. We can look at, what are some of the concerns that young people might have. But certainly they should get involved. And political parties are very important, but they're not the only part of our democratic system. I think political parties will continue to play a very important role. To the extent that parties aren't doing the job, they will either be moved on or other parties emerge, and there's splits. There's all those sort of things that happen in a democracy, and we are in interesting times democratically. I think, though, I haven't certainly given up at all on our democracy or democracy generally. I think it is by far the best system of government, so we need to make it work. And people being involved and active in that is absolutely critical to that, because it keeps leaders accountable, it keeps politicians accountable, and it helps make the system work. There aren't enough people who are directly involved in the political system in Australia at the moment, in my opinion.
Just quickly answer.
Just one thing, that wherever people get involved actively, whether it's on the left or the right, whichever political party they join, everybody, I think, should be very committed to the idea of social justice, because one of the things which really does create a lot of resentment and a great deal of difficulty in any society is inequality. And we've seen inequality grow in societies right across the world, and the greater the gap between those who have and those who don't. I mean, people on middle and low incomes over the last 10 years and more have seen their living standards stagnate, whereas people at the very, very top of the pile have seen their wealth increase, in some cases, fourfold. Well, in a situation like that, you're going to get a lot of unhappiness and a lot of resentment. That's very destabilising. So across the political spectrum, one thing activism, involvement, interest should really work towards is a much, much greater sense of social justice.
Just before we go to the next question, Lucy Kashohe, what would be your response about energising and activating young people?
Oh, absolutely. I would even recommend we take back civic education back to schools. I'm for participation, but not only students, everybody needs to participate, because if you believe something is broken, you join in and try to fix it. If you withdraw and leave it, this problem will only become worse. So I'm for participation, for everybody to get involved so that democracy can evolve and evolve with everybody in it.
Okay.
With your permission?
Yes.
Okay, this is something I do want to comment on. And I want to say, first of all, thank you so much for the question, because I think we're all struggling with this. I think first and foremost, I would tell your students to educate themselves. I mean, you help them educate themselves so they know what their politicians are doing or not doing, or what they're doing wrong or right. I mean, this is the most important thing. They need the knowledge. And too often, everyone's becoming too lazy because there's so much information, and to really sort out the real knowledge from it is very difficult. Now, it's true that there's a growing gap between politics and the people. But who to fix it if not the people? Now, I saw data that says that in the upcoming postal survey, there's an average of 65 saying they will vote, but only 58% of the people between 15 or 18 and 35. How come? I mean, how come? How do you want to make a difference if you're not even going to vote? Go vote.
Great.
A nice thing about that question is that we managed to bring you two a little bit closer together.
Bound to be one or two.
My God, Zed. There's some common ground. You are watching Q&A live and unpredictable, as you've seen, on a Monday night. And you can join Q&A in the House this Wednesday, this time with Shadow Minister for Transport and Infrastructure, Anthony Albanese. So send your questions via Twitter, Facebook or our website by noon on Wednesday. And at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, Anthony Albanese will join Q&A in the House, streaming live from Parliament on Facebook and News 24. And you can like the Q&A Facebook page to be notified. Our next question comes from Matthew Douglas.
Speaking as a 16-year-old young Liberal, I'm of the firm belief that climate change does exist and is one of the most important problems facing my generation today. However, I also recognise the need to have a gradual, responsible transition to renewables, and unless we create a battery backup, we will always need some type of fossil fuel to create baseline power. Is it not time that Labor and the left-wing crossbench focus on working with the government to form a responsible plan and not put millions of Australians into blackouts on our hottest summer days?
Thanks for your question, Matthew. Mark Dreyfus.
Oh, that sounded like Liberal Party talking points, I'm sorry to say.
Well, can I just jump in there? He said proudly he was a member of the Young Liberals and he's allowed to be.
We've got a problem in this country that we're now into the 5th year of a Liberal National Party government. Part of that government just voted, the National Party, at the weekend to continue their war on renewables. We've got a Liberal Party that is so divided that it cannot even agree to pick up Professor Finkel's report and implement the clean energy target, which is not the optimum, so as to provide some investment certainty in Australia.
The question went to Labor's role in all of this.
Sure, and Labor has not been in government since September 2013. I'm sorry to remind you, Matthew. And regrettably, because when we left office, there was a price on carbon in this country, a market signal. The Liberal Party came to office pledged to wreck that system. It did wreck that system, and it has replaced it with nothing. We have no coherent energy policy in this country. It's a tragedy because we have no energy policy in this country that is coherent in any way. There's been practically no investment. We've had soaring electricity prices over the last 4 years, soaring gas prices over the last 4 years, and ridiculous stunts day after day from the Prime Minister is all we're getting. Bullying power companies to no good end. Because it's about whether or not a particular 50-year-old power plant should close in 2022, if you please. A feasibility study that he boasts about every day, called Snowy 2.0, which won't be built until 2023. This is not an energy policy, and I haven't even got to climate change. We need a policy in this country that brings down emissions. Regrettably, since the Liberal Party has been in office, emissions have been rising. They are now rising steeply, particularly in the electricity sector, which is the largest producer of emissions. So Labor has been trying as hard as we possibly can to introduce some rationality and coherence into energy and climate change policy. And it's difficult from opposition, Matthew.
Well, Matthew clearly has an idea about what it is that he and others would like to see you do. Matthew, what exactly are you asking the Labor opposition to do in this policy setting?
Well, I think it's more important, instead of pointing out all the apparent mistakes of the current government, that Labor has a responsibility to their voters to start bringing new ideas and new propositions to the table instead of simply just pointing out the apparent mistakes of the current government.
I'm happy to. We've got lots of ideas. We called for a domestic gas reservation policy a year before the government got onto this and were derided by the government, saying that it was sovereign risk and a disaster for Australia. So that's number one. We've said to the government, even though we don't think the clean energy target recommended by Professor Finkel is the optimum outcome, it is a great deal better than nothing. Professor Finkel says that business as usual means continuing rising electricity prices. A clean energy target would see them brought under some kind of control.
We'll leave you,
so there's
Mark,
two things. I can keep going. I can keep going, but this is a government in chaos, divided, full of climate change deniers who are a disgrace to not only Australia but the rest of the world.
OK, Mark, rein it in for a second. I want to hear from...
Well done, Matthew, for getting under Mark Dreyfus' skin. Can I
the government that's under my skin. Matthew, good on you for being in the Liberal Party. It's the government that's under my skin.
Okay.
All right. Matthew, look, I think it's a really good question. There's a number of points, and I'll respond to a little bit of what Mark had to say. Certainly, I agree with you, and that we need to work on a number of areas of energy policy. That is that it is reliable, that it is affordable, and that we meet our emissions reduction targets. And we are systematically working towards each of those. But there is no doubt, and Mark said, that we've been, having a go at the power companies to no success. We saw even today that AGL are indicating... well, we did. So I don't know if you've seen the reports, but they are indicating...
They've been given 90 days.
They are indicating that they will find ways of keeping, either keeping that going in one form or another, the Liddell plant, or in coming up with alternatives. Because fundamentally, if you're going to... we've seen a lot of experiments from South Australia and the like with the 50% renewables, and it's, most people support renewable energy. But it's no point going down the path of renewables blindly, without storage, without the base load to back it up, and you need to do all of those things. And if you're not, and Mark, they do have one very big policy, which Mark didn't mention, which is a 50% renewable energy target, which is more than double the target we have at the moment. So that may feel like a good aspiration, but in practice what that would lead to is blackouts, it would lead to more expensive energy, and it would lead to serious shocks to our economy.
I have a question, though, that I guess derives from your observation, Matthew, and it might not come from the same place, but it does seem to me, and this is not related to any party political view, extraordinary that in a country blessed with sun, wind, coal, gas, uranium, that we are confronting a summer of power shortages. It is extraordinary. All of that. No matter where you sit in your political or ideological divide and which of those you prefer or don't like, you've got all of that, and we're going to have blackouts. How can that be?
Well, let's go to each of those. Uranium has been off the agenda in Australian politics for a long, long time. We could go to all of the reasons for that. Gas has become, under many states, state Labor governments at the moment, absolute moratoriums on exploration, whether that's fracking or whether that's conventional gas. And when it comes to new coal, we've seen the issues, and particularly with things like Adani. So you asked the question...
Get to investment in solar and wind.
Well, there is a lot of investment in solar and wind.
But clearly not enough.
Well,
because not enough certainty for the market to go ahead and do it.
Well, no, there's a lot of certainty in renewable energy. The issue is baseload power, and the issue is backup for that. So that's the fundamental issue. So you've rightly raised that question about some of those resources. There are a number of reasons why.
And none of them are the government's fault.
Well, the Commonwealth doesn't have most of those limits.
Okay. Mirav, did you want to jump in there?
No, yes, it's just that I'm also in the opposition, unfortunately. So I recognise so well the excuses of the government.
But if you were in government, I'd probably be hearing similar excuses from you.
Well, we unfortunately, and this is really regretful, that our party hasn't been in power for really much too long. So just wait and see what we do when we really get there.
We'll take that on trust. Our next question comes from Lloyd McDonald.
Yes, The Economist reported this week that there are now 400 extreme weather events a year, quadruple the number of extreme weather events recorded in 1970. We know that a significant number of Liberal Party politicians, and pretty much the entirety of the National Party, deny that human-induced climate change is happening. What can we do when our political parties are clearly governing for the interests that fund them rather than communities they're supposed to represent?
Oh, actually, I want to start with you on this one, Anthony, because self-interest is quite an ancient political tradition, really. There's nothing new here. So I guess we have some historical context here.
Yeah, and I suppose the self-interest in question, of course, is motivated by the fact that the fossil fuel industries in general have vast, vast amounts of investment in, the infrastructure which has been keeping the wheels turning for some time now, and it's not in their interests to be in too much of a hurry to switch over to alternative sources. And so you get a whole spectrum of views. On the one hand, you get people who really attack and question, criticize the science itself, all the way over to that Republican senator in the United States just recently who blamed Hurricane Irma on lesbianism. So you have quite a repertoire of excuses that you can appeal to there. I mean, the point is that the way the weather has been going recently is not by itself, of course, evidence of climate change, because there is, cyclical changes over shorter and longer periods of geological and historical time. But the scientific evidence is overwhelming. Climate change is happening. The climate change in question is human-induced. A tremendous increase of damage to the environment from emissions resulting from the Industrial Revolution just in the last couple of hundred years. So it's unquestionable.
So can I just draw you back to the question, though, which is that when the political parties are governing for their own interests that fund them, rather than for the communities they're supposed to be serving, what exactly can one do?
Well, I was just coming to that. So the real question is, how do we get the political process, because it goes really back to the point about the transparency of our democracies, our political processes back on track here. If you were to make transparent the lobby interests which are making this kind of difference to public policy decisions against the interests of the world as a whole, of the climate and of the people in your own country, then I think you have a real chance of getting people to cleave to the Paris agreements, for example, and everything else that needs to be done. And one thing that's extraordinary in the United States of America, you see Trump saying that he wants to renege on the Paris Agreement, but you see state governors, quite a few of them, and a lot of city mayors saying, no, we're not going to do that, we're going to go ahead. And there's an example, if you like, of a much more set of movements which are a lot closer to the grassroots.
Right. Well, we'll leave the politicians out of this one, I think. Our next question comes from Irving Wallach.
I'm a board member of the New Israel Fund Australia.
Oh, wow.
The New Israel Fund supports Israeli social justice and human rights organisations. Israel's known for its robust democracy and outspoken media. I'm sure you've heard the old joke about two Jews having three opinions. However, for some years, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's nationalist government has made it their practice to encourage attacks on Israel's social justice and human rights organisations by falsely painting them as makers of fake news and falsely helping to delegitimise Israel internationally. Do you see the threat to Israel's democracy as part of the same so-called fake news phenomenon, or is it something different? How's the health of Israel's democracy today and into the future?
Mirav.
Well, I think Israeli democracy is very strong. That goes together with, yes, I think the government which I oppose to and I'm in the opposition of is hurting and eroding, unfortunately. I don't think they'll succeed, though, because, and we were discussing right now the gap between politicians who do things for their own interest rather than for their communities. And I think, and you didn't ask about that, but maybe someone will, you look at both leaders, both governments, the Israeli one and the Palestinian one, the Palestinian Authority, and you see on both societies a vast majority that supports the two-state solution and wants a solution and wants peace, but you see two leaderships that are, I don't know, not interested, not capable, or not, I don't know what, but they're not doing it, even though it's in the best interests of their two societies in two countries. So I think the people ultimately know what they want, and the people in Israel want a democratic state, so they're not going to let anyone take it away from them.
Mark Dreyfus, did you want to jump in here as well?
Yeah, I defer to Mirav, obviously, Irving, about the state of Israeli democracy, because Mirav is working in it every day. The particular matter you raised about civil society organisations, the voices of NGOs, I think is an important one. I come from a political tradition which welcomes diversity of voices, and we've got a little bit of an analogy here in this country. We've got a government that in my policy area related to legal assistance has tried to shut down advocacy by community legal centres. On a much larger scale, regrettably in Israel, the right-wing government there has tried to shut down some the voices of some NGOs. Now, I'm not a practitioner of Israeli politics. I'm an Australian politician, but I look from afar and think the democracy would be healthier if more diversity of voices were welcomed and if there was not an attempt to shut down dissident voices. I think we benefit from dissident voices. I think we benefit from criticism. I know Anthony Grayling will agree with this. It's about people participating and making their voices heard and not trying to shut down opposing voices. It's exceptionally important that we welcome diverse voices even when we disagree with them, because we might just learn something and we might actually improve the quality of government.
Mr. Zelja, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I did, and I again would defer to Merav on some of the detail. And one of the great things I think as an external observer of Israel that I see is that people like Merav and others have a really strong ability in Israel to critique the government of the day, to attack the government of the day and to come up with alternate policies. And I'm often surprised at the vehemence with which some people attack Israel. Of course, it has its issues, and that's for the Israeli people to debate those issues internally. But as someone looking at it from the outside, it seems to me to still be a pretty vibrant democracy, and in comparison to many, many countries around the world and indeed in the region, it seems to cop more criticism than other countries where they don't have the same level of democracy and the same level of human rights.
Let's turn to our next question, and tonight it comes from Anna Eastoe.
The cashless welfare debit card has been trialled in 2 sites and now a third, with what the government are calling a success. However, a report released by the Department of Social Services showed that there was no improvement in crime statistics, and almost a third of participants felt their lives had been made worse. Do you think that such a program is going to be more beneficial than the cash welfare program?
Let's hear from you, Zelja.
Sure. Look, I think that Alan Tudge, who has brought this cashless debit card forward in Ceduna and East Kimberley and now is being expanded as part of the trial, I think it has been so far a great success. The figures that I've seen include there is less binge drinking, there is less violence, there are less people reporting into rehab, there are more sales in the stores of food, of clothes, of toys, of other children's goods. There are a range of measures. Gambling is down considerably. I think around I think in Ceduna alone, around $550,000 less went into gambling in the 12 months of the trial. So I would see that as a great success, where we are seeing some of those key indicators that we know have led to significant harm significantly lowered. Now, as Alan Tudge has said, it's not a panacea. It is not going to fix all of the issues in various communities. But where you are seeing that kind of progress, I think that is well worth pursuing and well worth persisting with. And certainly when you look, I'm a little more familiar with Ceduna through some of my time looking at this on a committee, certainly the community were very much part of the design of this, very much asked for this, and if you look at the results, I think we should be very pleased that there's been an improvement.
Lucy Shigohe, what do you think of the cashless welfare card?
What I think is anything that can help people manage their finances better and get off the poverty highway is welcome. What I think is the cashless trials should also be accompanied by financial literacy, educating educating people about the concept of money. Because if we just give them one mode, one prescription, it may work for a while and then we flip back. I like the cashless card idea, but I am passionate about educating everybody about financial literacy. We've seen even people who are otherwise educated in law and accounting not being able to handle their finances. So what I think is that trial should be accompanied by financial literacy and education.
Mark Dreyfus.
We're still in an experiment on this. As Anna said in her question, the results are pretty equivocal. There's been no indication that crime occurrence has dropped. I think it's worth looking at That's Labor's position. We've got communities with real problems. Some communities have asked for this to happen, and I think we can listen to those communities, but I certainly think we shouldn't be foisting it on communities, and I certainly think that the vast majority of welfare recipients do not need supervision in how to spend their money. So, yes, we're in a trial stage. The evidence seems a bit equivocal. Let's keep going with communities that want to do it, but keep looking very, very hard at whether it works.
We have time for just one last question tonight, and it's from Peter Anstey.
So, we've been talking about democracy in crisis, we've been talking about human rights, we've been talking about the viability of marriage. These are all philosophical questions, and so this question's inspired by you, AC Grayling, but it's for the whole panel. Is there a role for philosophers in public debate in Australia, and if so, what is that role?
Anthony, we've got this question here just because we have you as our honoured guest this evening.
You know, the thing about the philosophical tradition over the last 2,500 years, and not just in the West, but of course in the very rich traditions in India and in China and elsewhere, have a great deal to offer: perspectives, ideas, insights, discussions about distinctions that we need to draw. We saw a little bit earlier on that I attempted to draw a distinction between committed relationships on the one hand and legal institutions on the other, and that didn't stick very long, but if we did stick with it, we would see how it might be helpful. So I think philosophy as a set of traditions has a very great deal to offer. Now, everybody in this room, everybody watching this program, everybody in the world is a philosopher. You know that. When you go to the pub in the evening, you get smarter as the evening goes on and much deeper in the insight. And people like to discuss the kinds of things that we're discussing at the moment, quite rightly. So there's a great deal to offer. I don't think we should look to philosophers to tell us what to think. On the contrary, they should be encouraging us to do some thinking for ourselves. But there is an enormous amount that they can put into the public conversation as a contribution. And so I would encourage all of you who have an interest in philosophy, who read philosophy, and certainly my colleagues in universities and elsewhere who have the very, very great privilege to spend their lives studying and thinking about these things, to be a participant, to get engaged, to be active in this, and to help us all be a little bit clearer and a little bit more accurate in our thinking.
Setsaselja, do you think you could use the wisdom of the philosophers from time to time in your role?
Look, without a doubt, and as someone who did one semester of philosophy at university...
How'd you go?
Okay. I defer to AC, but I think I actually agreed with virtually everything he said just then, and that is that certainly philosophers aren't going to tell us what to do. We as a community have to make those judgments. But philosophers inspire us to think and inspire us to think in different ways. And if you look in the sphere I'm in politics, of course there's been many great political philosophers who have come up with ideas for the ordering of society, and we draw inspiration from those. Those ideas evolve over time, but we look to some of those great philosophers and say, well, this set of ideas works, but let's tweak this and let's tweak that. So our job in politics is to represent our communities and look at what works, and also bring a bit of the philosophy that we believe as a party or as individuals. So, of course, I think it's very, very important that we have public intellectuals, philosophers and other thinkers contributing to that.
Mark Dreyfus, are there great philosophers who have influenced you?
Sure. Zed said that we would eventually find something to agree on, and I agree with him on this. I am not, like Zed, in any doubt about the role of philosophers in our society. Think just of one great Australian philosopher, Peter Singer, and the contribution that he has made over many, many years. I'm sure not everybody in the audience agrees with every conclusion that Peter Singer has reached. He's been much demonised in this country, particularly by the right of Australian politics. I don't agree with everything Peter Singer has concluded, but I have been absolutely enriched by his thinking, by the way that he challenges us to think about particular moral issues that we all confront. And there's lots of other philosophers too, I read, but there you go, Ed, we agree. Philosophy can help us all not only in our politics, but I'd suggest in our daily lives.
It's the job of Q&A to bring these people together. Lucy Gashohe.
Yes, I think all these researchers, philosophers, scientists guide our thinking, encourage us to challenge the way we look at things, and definitely they have a great role to play.
And as our other honoured international guest.
Thank you so much.
We'll
So before I answer this question, I failed to thank you, I think Irving, right, for the work NIF is doing for Israel and in general the Jewish community in Australia, which is so vibrant and amazing and actually brought me here. So we owe them something too for that. But how can we possibly do without philosophers? A lot of what I said here and a lot of much of my work is being triggered by feminist philosophers who made me think and made me not look at things and not take anything for granted, which I urge you and everyone to do, not take anything for granted, which makes me say the most important thing. Yes, we need philosophers, but we need more women, voices, philosophers, and others in our world.
And you won't catch me disagreeing with that. That's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our marvellous panel, AC Grayling, Zed Seselja, Merav Michaeli, Lucy Kuchui and Mark Dreyfus. Continue the discussion now on Q&A Extra with Tracy Holmes and Silma Ichram on News Radio and Facebook. And join Q&A in the House this Wednesday, 5 o'clock Eastern Time on News 24, when Labor frontbencher Anthony Albanese is in the hot seat answering your questions. And follow Q&A on Facebook to find out more. Now, next week, I'm back here with you again, which I'm pleased to say. The Shadow Foreign Affairs Minister Penny Wong joins us as well, South Australian Greens Senator Sarah Hanson-Young and Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Brett Stevens. Until next week, good night.